So frankly, I think it's great to be together again in person to rekindle those relationships that we've all had in this relationship business. Um, and I think, when I think back about yesterday, I thought, wow, what a great start and what a great end to our day yesterday. That was the first day with the entertainment and the motivational speakers. The messages were clearly about making sure customers experience everything they can experience and make sure those are good with John, and then also for us to be very open-minded. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through our panel discussions today to talk about maybe maximizing revenues at the airport. Thank you, John and Morris, for all of that insight. It certainly motivated me to go back to my airport and really talk about some things we can do differently there. Congratulations again to Bobby for his award and certainly the staff. The leadership that they've provided over the years that I've been involved with them has been spectacular, and it never wanes. They're always open to new ideas themselves, so they practice what they preach. And we've got a really good situation in North Carolina. So today's session is about setting the stage for opportunities to generate more revenue for our airport operations and really getting the most out of our assets, right? So what, may I ask, is Exhibit A in the ALP? Anybody? What is that? Okay, that's the property map, right? So that's really, when you look at airports, that's what we have to work with. We have to figure out what we can get out per square foot, per acre, whatever, out of that land mass that we might have associated with our airport. Sorry about that. I know we're here. I know right now that the only thing that stands between us or between you and lunch is us. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The full bios of the panelists this morning are on the app, which I think was a really cool thing. So I'm not going to talk a lot about what you can read that yourself. But I think we've got some really talented and experienced people to be able to help us with some new ideas. We've got Keith Merritt, who is no stranger to North Carolina Aviation. He's really served on many panelists and agreed to serve again to talk a little bit about, of course, his company is Hamilton, Stevens, Steele, and Martin, but to talk a little bit about what the elements are of a good lease. And we've talked about that many times before, but to be reminded, I think is very good. We've got another panelist, Hector Ingram, out of Wilmington, real estate appraisal company, Ingram and Company, real estate appraisers. Great experience working on airports, going to help us out to try to figure out what land values are, what hangar values are, and help us maybe establish good rent rates for the assets that we have on the field. And then last we have David Brinson, who's president of Avian Solutions. And he's really brought on to talk a little bit about what he can do or what we can do or what he has seen nationwide on the private side. And so we're going to hear some of his experiences with Piedmont Hawthorne and Hawthorne as an FBO, managing FBOs, and then also what he's seeing across the country at different airports as he's developing projects for people at different airports all across the country. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. We'll start with the legal side first. Keith Merritt, we appreciate you being here this morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me again. It's always an honor and privilege to be able to present to you folks. It's a little interesting with this format in that I'm hearing myself about a second and a half after I say something on feedback from you guys. So if I pause, it's simply because I'm hearing myself again. So I'm here to talk to you about briefly about the legal issues with respect to leases. And the reality is that you can spend hours talking about the legalities. So I'm going to try to be brief today and just hit a few of the points that deal more with economic issues. The first thing, and I do want to make myself clear in that when I'm talking about leasing today, I'm talking simply about the airfield side of leasing. I'm not discussing the leasing of non-aeronautical property because that is a whole different set of rules that deal with off-airport or concession leases or things that are not on your airfield. The first thing I want to discuss, it's fairly rare that we actually get a case in North Carolina that deals with leasing, but since the last time we've gotten together, there was actually a case out of the North Carolina Court of Appeals, and it's a case that involved RDU, and it's with the Umstead Coalition. And so RDU had a piece of property that it wanted to lease to a company to use that property as a quarry. And this was property that was, obviously it's off airfield, but the issues that came up are that this is property that was not purchased with federal funding, which made it under a slightly different set of rules now with respect to the FAA. But the issue came up as to whether or not the authority had the ability to lease this property. RDU is obviously operated by an authority, and those authorities, like any authority that you may have for your airport, if you are under that type of governance, is created by a legislative charter. So there's a special piece of legislation that creates each authority, and there are certain powers that are provided to each authority in that document, and each one of them is unique. The charter for RDU did contain the usual provisions that gave it the power to lease property. The specific provision in the RDU charter stated that they had the ability to lease the property for 40 years. So there are a lot of things that came up in this case, but the one issue that, or two issues that are important for authorities in leasing, one argument was made that, of course, the North Carolina general statutes with respect to municipalities only allow leases for 10 years. And the Umstead Coalition claimed that because this lease was 40 years, that it violated that statute. And this issue comes up frequently with respect to how long a term an airport in North Carolina can have in a lease. And that issue was more or less resolved by an attorney general's opinion years ago that said that airports are not subject to that 10-year limitation. But what the court did is that they found that the authority was not subject to a set of statutes in Chapter 160A of the North Carolina General Statutes that deal with the powers and duties that are given to municipalities. It had always kind of been assumed that authorities were subject to Chapter 160A. There are a lot of things in Chapter 160A that are useful to an authority with respect to things like quorums, corporate powers. But the court determined that the authority was not subject to Chapter 160A. So at least with respect to airports that are operated by authorities, it gave even another justification for allowing leases in excess of 10 years because it said you just aren't subject to that statute anymore. The other thing that this case did is there was a claim that the airport authority had violated the open meetings law. And the case did make it clear that you guys as authorities are subject to the open meeting laws. So just briefly, that means you can't meet in secret. You can't have a majority of your authority meet by themselves and not in a public setting to discuss an issue. you can't have a meeting that's not properly called. So it's important, the case is important to the extent that it does say clearly that you are subject to those rules. So why is this important to leasing? Well, first of all, again, if you're an authority, you're clearly outside of that 10-year limitation now. And it's also important because if you're an authority, you probably need to go back and look at your charter that created the authority and look and see what powers and duties are set out in that document, because that's really the document that is going to govern how you are able to lease, what you're able to do. So I would advise you all to go back and pull that document out, find that legislation. For some of you, it's probably pretty old legislation when these authorities were created, but pull them out and see what authority you have. And it might be that you need to talk with your local legislative delegation about amending or updating your charter to make sure that you have the authority that you need. And then just briefly, a few other things with respect to the legal side of leasing. And I kind of chose these things to talk about based upon questions that I've gotten from clients over the course of the past year or so, and just try to address them because they seem to be ones that come up fairly frequently. The first one I have is, the question I get is, well, how long should a lease be? And the answer to that question varies depending upon kind of who's paying for the hangar that you're leasing. From the regulatory standpoint, the FAA says that if it's the tenant that is paying for the hangar, that you have to give them a long enough lease to recover the economic investment that they have made in that structure, in that hangar. And they go on to say that usually a time of 30 to 35 years is sufficient for a tenant to recover the value of their investment and make a reasonable return on that investment. So that is kind of the rule that applies if you have somebody that's putting their money into the hangar. If the airport already owns the hangar, certainly for tie downs for T hangars and such, where there isn't that level of investment that's being made by the tenant, you can have shorter leases because, again, there's nothing that's saying they need to recover any economic value from the lease. Do keep in mind that even though the state of North Carolina regulation with respect to leases over 10 years doesn't apply to airports, the FAA says that any lease that's over 50 years is basically considered a sale of the property. So you don't want to have any lease that's in excess of 50 years. And that includes leases, and I've seen a few of these this year, where there are perpetual renewal terms at the option of the tenant. So theoretically, the lease could go on for 100 years at the option of the tenant. And we've checked with the state and with FAA, and those type of provisions they would consider to be in violation of the 50-year term limit. So if you have that type of renewal provision in your lease, it's something that you need to correct. The second question I've gotten a lot lately is, well, does a lease have to have a rent escalation clause? And what the FAA generally says about that is if you have a lease that is in excess of 5 years, that you need to have a rent escalation clause within that lease. And they recommend tying it to some recognizable index, consumer price index, or something like that. But I also think that an escalation provision that's a certain percentage over a certain period of time during the term of the lease is also one that would be perfectly fine. And you see those in a number of leases, but I've seen a number of leases this year that are long-term leases, talking 20 years or more, where there's no escalation provision. And certainly the value of the property that you're leasing will increase over that time. So just like any private commercial entity that's leasing property, you want to make sure you have a provision that's at least trying to keep up with inflation, with other increases in value of the property over time. There are some other things that should be included within any lease, or that are mandated to be included with any lease. You need to have a provision that makes sure that you have the ability to control what's going on the airport property, meaning that provisions that state that the lease is subordinate to your state and federal sponsor obligations. Also, provisions that allow you to redevelop the airport if you need to, because if you're entering into a lease that's a 40-year lease, as you're sitting here today, it's very difficult to maybe see what would happen 40 years from now. And it may be that you need to relocate a hangar that you've leased. So it's always good in my mind to have a provision that allows you to make sure that you are controlling your development on the airport. And that may mean that at some point in time, you might have to tear a hangar down. So you have provisions to make sure that if that happens, that the tenant, if they're the ones who have built that hangar, are able to get their investment back out if need be. But those are provisions that, again, allow you to continue to make sure that you're able to develop the airport as you want. The other issue that comes up quite frequently is, what do you do with respect to assignment or subleasing on for a hangar? And those of you who I've worked with will know that my general feeling is that I'm not a big fan of allowing any assignment or subleasing, because usually what happens is that over time, if you allow someone to sublease their space, they're going to be able to sublease it sometimes for more than what they're paying the airport. So they're able to actually make money off of that hangar that's on your property. And to me, that's taking money away from, or money that could be made by the airport. But in any event, if you're allowing subleasing or assignment, you need to make sure that that requires the consent of the airport before any assignment or sublease. And one thing that I've had a couple folks insert into leases recently is a provision that says that if the tenant wants to assign or sublease, that the airport has basically a right of first refusal to purchase the hangar at that point in time. And it may be that it's in the economic best interest of the airport to purchase the hangar rather than allowing an assignment or a sublease of it. There are other required provisions that are in leases. If the tenant is providing a service to the public, then you need to make sure that the required provisions that are in Sponsor Assurance 22 are included within the lease. And those are the ones that are generally saying that the person will furnish services on a reasonable and not unjustly discriminatory basis, that the charges will be reasonable and not unjustly discriminatory with respect to prices. And this goes back to the conversation that we have a lot, in that airports are generally required to treat similar users of the airport in the same manner. So you shouldn't have radically different pricing for something that is the same type of user. Again, we could go and spend a lot of time on this. That doesn't mean that you can't have differences, but sometimes you just have to justify why you might have a difference in pricing between one lease and another. And then finally, the other required language, back a few years ago, the FAA came out with a set of required terms in certain contracts. There are some required terms for leases. They basically are dealing with civil rights provisions. So any leasing that you have, there's required language with respect to non-discrimination based upon civil rights, and also that the facilities that may be offering a service to the public are made available to the public without discrimination. So when we talk about discrimination in an airport lease, you have two things you're talking about. You have the required provisions with respect to economic non-discrimination, and then you also have the required provisions with respect to civil rights non-discrimination. So that's a very brief kind of summary of some things that I think that you should consider in your leasing. Obviously, there are a lot more legal requirements, but given the time here today, I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues to talk more about the economic issues.
Keith, thank you so much for those comments. I know you're always there, ready to help us out, and you've just got some great experience with that. So we appreciate you participating this morning.
I am going to turn off my video so that I don't loom behind these two gentlemen quite so long. So.
Okay, that sounds good. Next up, we're going to invite Hector Ingram to talk a little bit about values. You know, we talked about what the property that we have, but what is it really worth, and how are those values determined? So welcome, Hector, to the North Carolina Airports Association. We appreciate your participation in this panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to focus what I'm about to say mostly on the area of expertise that I have, which is small regional airports east of I-95. My experience is that the larger national airports and larger regional airports are pretty capable at getting the best out of their lease rates for their hangars. I think, based on what I've seen, most of the hangars at most of the airports in most of the smaller markets are probably underleased. It would appear to me that a lot of these properties have been leased year after year after year based on very old leases, or airport managers are maybe looking to other airports for indications of what lease rates for T hangars and box hangars should be. And I'd like to offer an alternative solution that I think would get everyone in line with what the market should really be. We're looking to provide a rental rate that is fair to the tenant and to the landlord. And I think the best way to do this with special purpose properties like hangars, they really can't be used for anything else, is to look at the value, the underlying asset value, the land value, the site improvement value, the hangar value itself, the structural metal components. And that value will drive the lease rate. Essentially, a lease rate, a base term, a base lease rate should be based on what you could sell or buy that asset for. The problem that we have is most hangars can't be bought or sold. So we really need to look at the value they contribute and determine what is a reasonable rate of return for that value, and that becomes your base lease rate on an annualized basis. Now, the operational costs, those are negotiable between the landlord and the tenant, the taxes, the insurance, the utilities, and so forth. So I'm really just talking about the value of the asset, the base rent, and the terms that are involved that make sense for the landlord and the tenant. So we've got the three components. We've got the underlying land value. We've got the site improvements, which is basically everything that's horizontal, pavement, and so forth. The utilities, water and sewer if they're provided, electricity. And then we've got the structural building components. The first thing that you need to look at is what would the land be worth? And I would encourage you not to go out and look at what the last McDonald's sold for in your community and apply that land value to your location. I think you have to look at an airport land as having a largely commercial service or light industrial, highest and best use. That's the nearest I can find to it. I don't think you need to be looking to a retail or a multifamily land sale as a comparable. So what I generally do when I'm appraising, estimating a fair market rental rate is I'll go out and look for sales around the airport that have a reasonably similar highest and best use. And I realize in some communities there are very, very few sales to work with, but I think it's important to be reasonable. What could you reasonably sell this land for? The building and site improvements are a little bit easier. There are a number of different ways to get estimates for buildings, the replacement cost new of a hangar. I noticed downstairs that you had a number of sponsors who provide the construction costs for these. This information is fairly freely available. The same with the site improvements, the asphalt, concrete, and so forth. And once you have an idea of what the replacement cost is, you need to consider the depreciation. If you've got a hangar that's 40 years old, you can't apply a value for replacement cost new. But by the same token, you can't say, well, it's 40 years old, it's fully depreciated, it has no value. I think you have to look at the real effective age of that hangar. So a hangar that was built 40 years ago that meets most of the requirements in terms of sort of width and depth and height, and it's been reasonably well maintained, even though it's 40 years old, may have an effective age that's less than that, say 20 years. So if you have $1 million replacement cost new on a 40-year-old hangar with an effective age of 20 years, you might apply a depreciation rate of, say, 50%. So you take that value and you add it to your underlying land value, and then you do the same thing with the site improvements. You say, okay, we've got concrete at $15 a square foot, we've got asphalt at $12 a square foot, we've got, X thousand square feet, and it's 50% depreciated. That'll give you a rough idea of what the asset value is underneath. And you then look at a rate of return that you would expect. And, land rates of returns, depending on what type of land it is and, where it is and so forth, can range from sort of 5% to 11%. Building rates of return can be anywhere from 10% to 15 or 16%. And you'll generally, for sort of ease of purpose, apply a blended rate. And that rate's generally going to be between 10 and 13%. So if you have a $100,000 asset, you're going to have probably between $10,000 and $13,000 a year in base rent, or between, 1,000 or so per month. And I think if you follow that guidance, you'll have a fairly good idea of what that property should be getting. And I think you'll be quite surprised how that compares to the actual lease rates in place for a lot of, especially the older assets in the smaller airports. You can go looking for comparable sales. They're very difficult to find. You can go looking for comparable leases, and I think it's important if you are going to use comparable leases to set your lease rate that you compare apple to apple. Compare T-hangar to T-hangar, box hangar to box hangar. Look at an airport that has similar demographics to you. Don't be looking at Charlotte to provide hangar rates for an airport in Harnett County. It's just not the way it works. So I think since each airport is fundamentally unique, this cost estimate and a rate of return as a base rent is probably the easiest way to go and the fairest way to go to you and the tenant. As far as terms go, for a new hangar where the tenant is going to build a hangar, you've got to give them enough time to, at the very least, finance that. So that would set the minimum term at 15 years. And ideally, you want to give them, from a financial perspective, 20 years to amortize that mortgage. But from a practical standpoint, you probably need to give them the rights to occupy that structure out a little bit further, 35 years or so they can fully depreciate it. Now, that doesn't mean it has to be one 35-year term, and it doesn't have to be at a flat rate. That would not be the way to go. The smart way to go, I think, would be to give them an initial term, 10, 15 years, with a base rate starting in year one, and then bumping up 2%, 3% per year, whatever you think is appropriate. CPI is often used. If you link it to CPI, you've got a little bit of protection. You know, we could go into a time of inflation. We've got a lot of capital in the system right now. We're all scared to death as appraisers. We're all scared to death of inflation. And I think it's coming. So build it into your lease structures. I would urge you at the end of 10 years, rather than just go to a new graduated rate, have a fair market rental study done. Have an appraiser or a real estate agent or someone competent come in and look at, again, what's the cost value of this property, what's a fair rate of return, what's the new base rent, and go on from there. It's really up to you how many options you give these folks, but give them enough time to do what they need to fairly take care of the bank, the mortgage, and to take care of their depreciation. Be careful not to go beyond, you don't want to get into a capital lease situation where the IRS considers it essentially a purchase. So that would generally be less than 50 years. I think we discussed that early. And that's about all I have. I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have.
So Hector, I think what we'll do is we'll ask David maybe to say a few words, and then we hopefully will have some time left over for some questions. So thank you so much for that insight. And, you know, there's always a question about what that value is from one airport to another. We do need to kind of get all on the same page, and I think clearly there are some airports that aren't charging enough, including mine, that we really need to look more closely at generating some more revenue that way. So thank you for participating this morning. Next up is David Brinson, who's president of Avian Solutions out of Virginia. He's got experiences, like I said, from the private sector, and we'll let him talk a little bit about some of those experiences and what he sees out there in the industry. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Bob, for including me in this panel. It's good to express some of my experiences in the past and share those with you. We live in such a different world today than we did even just a few years ago. COVID is just one of the examples. We're in a rapidly changing environment. And then it's further complicated in our industry because airports are so different. Every airport is different from every other airport, and it has different pressure points, different politics, different requirements. One of the things that Bob asked me to comment on was the lease. What makes a good lease? And it's not just the lease. There are other documents. It's sort of like the Constitution. It's not just the Constitution, it's the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence. So on an airport, naturally the lease is the fundamental, most important document, but it has to be supported as well by airport minimum standards. And so that plays a very important role in that. And then there are development standards. So if you have somebody that wants to come on your airport, naturally they're going to want to look at the lease, they're going to look at the minimum standards, but they also should have guidance as a development standards, either it be an FBO or someone that wants to build their own corporate hangar. So if you have those development standards, to me, that's one of the very, very important documents to have, because you don't want to end up on an airport, and we've all seen this, where you have an orange hangar over here and you got a green one over here, and they use different types of siding. In some cases, they don't do any landscaping, and yet the hangar right next door has landscaping, they have architectural fence, and the other guy's got chain link fence. So that's why development standards are so important. The other thing that is missed oftentimes is the lease application. This can be used in a myriad of situations. If you do an RFP, you can incorporate that application. And in 2 pages asking various questions, very much like an employment application, you address a tremendous amount of information, contact information, who is the perceived lessee? Is it a foreign national? Is it somebody maybe possibly has been convicted of a felony? Do they have pending litigation against them or the corporation that wants to be on your airport? So all of these are very important factors. It also separates sort of the tire kickers, the fishers, the people that come to you and say, well, what if? After a certain period of time of the what if, you want to pull out that application, get them to fill it out, and it has to have at the very end of it a declaration statement that the facts are, that the information that they are providing is truthful and factual. But again, it separates the people that are the tire kickers from the people that are really serious about wanting to be on your airport. Going back to the minimum standards, one little shared thing. There's an airport about within 15 miles of JFK, and the airport minimum standards had not been updated since 1971. In fact, they were so old that nobody had taken the time to even put them into an electronic document. The only way you could get it was a scanned document. And again, this is a fairly major airport in the state of New York. So airport minimum standards, your lease, all of these documents should be reviewed and augmented every 5 years. Again, we live in such a changing environment than where we were just a few years ago. There's been some talk about lease term by both Keith and Hector, and I'd like to support that a little bit. The FAA does not recognize any lease beyond 50 years. But today, if you have an FBO or you have a corporate hangar tenant that wants to come in and build their own hangar on your property, they're going to make a huge investment on your airport. 20,000 square foot hangar, even a 15,000 square foot hangar with some office and shops, we're looking at cost today somewhere in the range of $8 million to as high as $15 million. So you want enough time to amortize that investment, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. Hector mentioned having CPIU. I personally kind of like the idea of establishing a base rate of increases of 2 to 3%. And if you have periods of extraordinary inflation, they have a clause in there that allows you to reevaluate at some point. And if you don't want to do initial terms beyond 20, 25 years, put option periods in there. The IRS under Section 168 states that they have, the person who is making the capital investment has 39 years to write that piece of property off. So even the federal government recognizes that you need 39 years to amortize a piece of property. So I personally am in favor of 40-year leases made up by 20, 25 years, the base term, and then have options that would extend the lease out to 40 years. The one thing that I've heard among one operator in North Carolina, one airport sponsor, was that corporate and general aviation does not pay its fair share. Well, first of all, corporate and general aviation makes the investment. Second of all, they're pretty independent. They don't require a whole lot of security. They don't require a lot of snow removal and a lot of the things that go into the upkeep of the rest of the airport. So I differ with that and think that corporate and general aviation does pay its fair share because they make a huge investment in the community. And North Carolina has some really nice airports, so I think that overall the state recognizes that in order to have development in your community and to provide jobs and to have additional capital investment outside of the airport, you have got to have a decent airport with decent airport services to go with it. So all of this ties back to longer term leases and inviting corporate development on your airport. As far as revenue is concerned, I think that we have reached a point where we've got to be somewhat creative, and we've got to go back and look at the way we're doing business and the way that we have done business in the past and figure out how we can enhance revenue. One of the things that I've observed is that there are many airports out there, and this is not very popular with an FBO saying this, but the airport flow fees need to be reevaluated. I see many airports out there that haven't changed their airport flow fees in 30 and 40 years. And, you know, you look at some airports, I know of at least one where the airport flow fee is $1 a gallon. That's roughly speaking, and that's Washington Dulles. And I'm not suggesting that everybody go to $1 a gallon, but I am suggesting that you evaluate it, and even though it may not be popular, particularly with the small airplane operators, that you start looking at increasing, maybe incrementally, look at it every 5 years, but don't leave it static for 20, 30, and 40 years. Everything is going up. Today, a G5 or the latest G650, we're now looking at $75 million airplanes, brand new. Do you think that guy is going to worry about whether or not you're charging 15 cents flow fee or charging 25 cents flow fee? I don't think so. You know, we in the FBO industry are always getting beat up about fuel prices, but the harsh reality is that the fuel that you put in that airplane is still the cheapest thing you can put in the airplane. And we said that 50 years ago. Landing fees. Landing fees is another thing that hasn't increased in maybe 20, 30, 40 years. Reevaluate it every 5 years. Don't necessarily look at the airport next to you because they may be stuck in the mud and they may be just continuing along the same lines of not making changes in 30, 40 years. Be bold enough to make your own decision about what you think the market will bear and how you need an increase to support your airport. One of the things that I see that, and we can all thank, and I don't thank Signature very often because I competed against them for 15 years at Washington Dulles, but we can all thank Signature for implementing handling and/or facility fees, not to be confused with parking fee or ramp fees, for those airplanes that come into your airport and don't buy any fuel. They use your bathroom, they use your gate that somebody has to operate, they use the fact that you park the airplane on your facility, and yet they come in and they don't buy fuel from you. And many of these companies are major corporations. In fact, one of them is one of my clients. They have their own fuel farm. And oftentimes they're retail customers. I could sit here and name half a dozen retail businesses that are worth billions of dollars, and yet they have their own fuel farm and they will fly around the country and not buy one drop of fuel. A Gulfstream today can go from the East Coast to the West Coast and back without buying fuel. Think about that. So a lot of people are tankering. It's much more efficient to tanker. Back in the day of the G3, it cost you about 20, 25% to tanker. A G650, it only cost about 5% to tanker. So keep that in mind, that you need to start charging fees. If you have a private FBO, figure out some creative ways to do some revenue sharing. One of the things that we did years ago, we got an associated new chairman with a company that we were working with. The company was owned by Carlyle. Most of you know who Carlyle is. And they brought the CEO in to talk to all of us. And one of the things that he talked about was 3 up, 3 down. And what it means is that every year you sit down with your staff and you create an opportunity for them to enjoy the benefits of this as well. And it's an exercise in looking at every single one of your vendors and figuring out how you can reduce cost, and at the same time, look at the 3 up, which would be those things that you can enhance revenue from. So it doesn't necessarily, even though it's 3 up, 3 down, it could be 5 up and 5 down, or it could be 5 up and 2 down. But the point is that you're evaluating every single aspect of your business, both from a revenue standpoint and from a standpoint of reducing cost. The one that sticks in my mind is that we had a waste management contract, and one of our accounting people reached out to them and told them that we needed to reduce our cost of waste management. And they said, well, you've got a 1-year contract. If you go to a 3-year contract, we can reduce it by a fairly significant amount. And because you're not in the food business, we can offer you, instead of 1 week pickup, we can put 2 dumpsters on your facility and pick up every 2 weeks. We were able to reduce our waste management cost by 50%. By looking at, and I know this, we were doing about 12 million gallons a year at Dulles, so this isn't going to relate to everybody here in terms of dollars. But in the first 2 years of doing the 3 up, 3 down, we added $250,000 to the bottom line. And I was, frankly, I came away happy that we had contributed that much to the bottom line, but I was a little bit embarrassed that we hadn't done it before. So anyway, it actually was fun. We involved all the employees in it. And one other thought on that subject, everybody's having trouble getting employees today, and many of you are airport sponsor run FBOs. One of the things that we did was we actually got our current employees to be recruiters for other employees. And that's how we got our best people, quite frankly. I have one individual from Central America, and he went out and recruited about 5 or 6 different people. They were all great employees, and he was making about $300 a month as an incentive for bringing these people into our organization. So it really worked out well. In closing, one of the things that I'd like to comment on is municipal run airports. And that is that too often times, smaller municipal airports or airport sponsor run FBOs, to be very concise, are giving it away. Now I know you can't legally talk among yourselves about margin, but I can. I can encourage y'all to look at your margin and to have reasonable margins on your fuel. Because if you are not at market price and you think that you're going to attract people to your airport because you've got low fuel price, we commonly refer to that as the $100 hamburger in the FBO world. And you've got the guy that has a 172 and he flies to your airport and maybe you're 50 cents a gallon below market, and he puts on maybe 20 or 30 gallons of fuel. It costs you way too much to drive that fuel truck or even to provide that self-service unit to give deep discounts on avgas to attract that guy from your neighbor airport. First of all, you shoot yourself in the foot. And second of all, you're hurting your brethren neighbor airport down the road. So margins need to be, while they need to be competitive and we're all under pressure to keep prices down, you still need to make a decent margin on the product that you deliver. And the last comment I have is do not buy into the AOPA narrative that airports and FBOs are charging way too much for the product and the service that they deliver. The AOPA is losing membership every day because, quite frankly, we're an aging population that own these airplanes, and they're just not flying their airplanes. But they're not flying their airplanes because of the economics. In fact, when I was a lot younger than I am today, in the 60s, motor fuel was generally, high test motor fuel was in the range of 30 to 35 cents a gallon. At the airport, it was 60 cents a gallon. So do the math. Today, motor fuel is, high test motor fuel is in the range of 350 to 370 a gallon. I just bought it last night, 333, 334, somewhere in that range. And the super high test was like 379 a gallon. So if you use that same analogy that I used in the 60s of what motor fuel was costing and what jet fuel and high octane or 100 low lead is selling for on your airport, the economics are about the same, if not better. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, David. We've got a few minutes left over for some questions. We have a microphone Eugene is making available for anyone that does have some questions. Anyone? Yes, sir.
I'd like to hear your thoughts about exclusive rights at the airport. We have a small airport, basically have one FBO who manages the entire operation. And during our renewal of our lease and grants with FAA and so forth, they do cover the exclusive rights of operators at the airport. What's been your experience or understanding on how that works at a small airport?
Well, when you refer to exclusive rights, what are you talking about? Are you talking about an FBO that wants to come in and compete with you, or are you talking about exclusive rights on a specific piece of property that somebody wants to develop a corporate hangar?
Well, I'm not really sure exactly how much it covers, but it's basically FAA says you can't have exclusive rights at an airport that prevents another operator from providing a service that is already being provided by another operator.
Okay, there is a provision. Are you a municipal FBO or an airport sponsor FBO, or do you have a private FBO?
We have a private FPO.
Okay, as long as you have a private FBO, if you have the land available on the airport, you are required by FAA to lease that land to that second operator, whether or not it makes economic benefit or not, economic sense or not. You cannot block it based on economics. And as the FAA says, everybody has a right to go broke. There is, I have a friend and colleague, David Bennett, who is the former chief legal counsel for the FAA, and he has since retired, and he is now doing that, and he could probably address that issue better than I can. But you cannot extend exclusive rights to an FBO as long as you have the land available. Now, there are many things that you can require. As I talked about in the beginning, the airport minimum standards, development standards, and the application, all of those documents are very important. And my guess is that if you really do not want a second operator on that field, you need to make your documents as tight and as concise as you can to make it at least to the point where whoever comes in there and wants to compete has to compete on an equal basis. If your current operator has a fuel farm and they've got 30,000 gallon fuel farm, then the guy that comes in there to compete against them should have a 30,000 gallon fuel farm. If they've got 10,000 square feet of FBO, then the guy that comes in, and your minimum standards is that first document that puts it on equal standing, but it also protects you and it protects your FBO.
But if you don't have any additional property, you really
If you don't have the property, they can't compel you to make somebody give up a piece of property so that you. Yeah. So if they have exclusive rights by default, that's acceptable.
Okay.
So if you don't have the land, they've got exclusive rights by default.
All right. One quick question. If we sign lease agreements for 5-year increments for 20 years, and the lease agreement basically doesn't include any option for adjustment of lease payments, is there any way during that, and they have the option to renew every 5 years without doing anything, is there any way to go in and say, we need to take a look at revising this, or are you
Well,
pretty much stuck with that?
The key to what you're asking is the option. If the option is not clearly spelled out and does not overly restrict you, then my suggestion would be that what you do is you sit down with your FBO and say, look, here's what we need to do. We need to come to some amicable agreement. One of the things that I failed to mention here, and I made a note on, is that the airport sponsor and the FBO need to sort of take what I perceive in often cases contentious and bring it down and recognize that we're really all partners. And create a partnership, more of a partnership between your FBO and the airport. That's the way it should be, but I see too oftentimes it's contentious, and oftentimes the reason it is because you sort of have people that, I mean, let's face it, we all have different egos, and so there's the ego of the airport, both the public persona and the private persona. There's the private and the public persona of the FBO operator, but if you can get these people together and get people to walk a little bit in each other's tennis shoes, you can create more of a partnership type of an agreement. And revenue sharing is one of the ideas that maybe there's some creativity there that you can come up with. And again, the option period, if you have some latitude and different things, be creative.
Thank you.
I'll add to that, and I'm not sure if I am, oh, there I am.
Keith, you still there?
That's one reason why, with respect to the required lease provisions, your lease should have a provision in it that makes it subordinate to your FAA sponsor assurances. And where this comes up is if you don't have an escalation provision in the agreement, theoretically you're violating your sponsor assurances. You're not making the airport as self-sustainable as possible. You're not in line with the guidance that requires a rent escalation provision if you have a lease that's more than 5 years. So while I agree that the best course of action is to try to negotiate something that would amend the lease to include those things, you also can go back and say, look, our lease is not in compliance with our sponsor assurances, and we need to make adjustments to that to make sure that the state and the FAA are not going to come after us and say that they aren't going to give us any more funds. So there is a route that you can take, but that's one of the reasons why your leases should always contain that provision that says that the lease is subordinate to your obligations. One other thing I'd add with respect to the second FBO coming in, and I use the same language, the FAA says everybody has the right to come on an airport and fail. The exception to that would be if your current FBO has excess land that they're not using, that could be used by the second FBO coming in. Theoretically, you may have some obligation to make that excess land available to that second FBO. But that is an unusual circumstance that they'd be using more land than they would need. But again, I think there's a way you can address the issue with the lease not having escalation provisions in it.
Keith and David, Mark Davidson, Winston-Salem. One of the things he originally said at the beginning, I just want to clarify, if you have a company managing it, the airport says we want exclusive right to be the FBO, but we're hiring a management firm, we're going to collect the revenue from the fuel sales and pay them a fee. Do you necessarily have to have a second FBO? Can you still have that exclusive right?
That's an interesting question. I actually faced this at Barnstable in Massachusetts. The municipality was operating an FBO and was selling all the jet fuel on the airport. And the say-so, which was an aircraft management company, sued the airport on this issue of exclusive rights. And they hired me as their expert. And as they were hiring me, I told them they were not going to win the case. And they hired me anyway. And it was a contentious situation between the FBO or the say-so and the airport. And it doesn't matter if, in my opinion, Keith may disagree with me, but because you have a management company, they are still managing the asset on behalf of the airport. And the airport does have exclusive rights in terms of being able to block a second FBO from coming on the airport and selling fuel commercially. Now, it does not have the right, however, to keep you from self-fueling. And there's a whole set of advisory circulars on this issue of self-fueling. Self-fueling or self-serve, not to be confused with self-serve avgas or, what we see a lot. The nomenclature is a little bit difficult to get your head around because it says basically the same words, but it has different meaning. You cannot keep somebody from self-serving, but you can block them from being in the commercial business. And one of the things that I often add in airport minimum standards is the word as otherwise disperse or dispense, excuse me. And the reason that language is in there is if somebody comes in, builds their own corporate hangar and builds a fuel farm, and then they sublet to some other tenant, then that other tenant, they may entice them to come in by saying, oh, well, we'll provide the fuel service to you. Well, what they could very easily do is get that tenant to buy a load of fuel, and then they could figure out another surreptitious way to get around the idea that they're actually selling the fuel. So that's why you want to be very careful with your minimum standards and have that language in there that says sell and or otherwise dispense. So I think in your case where you've got an operator that is managing the facility for the benefit of the airport, you effectively have that exclusive right, but it's a legally exclusive right because it's in benefit for the airport.
Keith?
I agree. I mean, if you're talking about an airport that has a proprietary exclusive as to the sale of fuel, I don't think it makes a difference. If it's just an FBO that's providing the fueling, then I think you would have to allow the second group to come in. With respect to the self-fueling, another way to deal with that, in addition to the minimum standards, I know in any of the leases that I write for an airport, it's always addressed in the lease that the entity has the right to self-fuel their own aircraft with their own employees, but they don't have the right to provide fueling to anybody else, including people who may be their guest, whatever. But you do need to address the issue of self-fueling and make sure that you're not allowing someone to provide fuel to someone other than themselves.
Thank you. So we're out of time. I don't know. We have, Daniel, you have a question? Someone?
This may be too long, but I was curious just from that broader economic context of retaining and recruiting businesses to come in to an airport. How do you use hangars as a part of that package? Because they may be making other investments in the community. Are there ways to incentivize the hangar process, the development of hangar space at an airport to support that economic development and that broader economy.
I'm sorry, I don't completely understand the question. Are you asking why is it important, or?
No, how to incentivize that whole process, and are there things to think about from the airport perspective of being just one piece in that larger chain of how do you get that business to locate in your community? Because there's lots of other things
Oh,
they're considering.
I see what you're talking about, total economic development and that sort of thing to bring somebody to your community. I think the biggest thing that you can do as far as community economic development is have the documents that I talked about, know your property, and have a copy of your airport layout plan, and then reduce it down so that if General Motors wants to come to your community, you've got and they've got corporate airplanes and they want to build a hangar, you can show them a very specific piece of property that can be developed on that airport. And then you can get into a lot of different things. You know, you could come up with some tax incentives perhaps. I know that always opens up a can of worms when you start talking about tax incentives, but let's face it, it is an enticement to bring people to the airport and bring corporate development to your community. We see a lot of it. I mean, and it's not necessarily airports. I think it's other property that's developed within your community, and we see that. I go way back in North Carolina. I cut my teeth in Charlotte as a charter operator 50 years ago, and as a charter pilot, not an operator. And back then, there were a lot of communities in North Carolina that were giving pretty decent tax incentives. That's one of the reasons that North Carolina is such an industrial state. And so I like the idea of giving tax incentives. The second part of that, though, is I like where communities give that tax money back to the airports. So it certainly helps with the airport development. It eases a little bit of that pain, if you will, for the guy that's paying a heavy tax on a Gulfstream or any other of the larger corporate aircraft.
Heath, you wanted to say something as well relative to that, or?
No, I think the only thing I'd add is obviously with giving tax incentives and such is you're really working in cooperation with whatever the county or city around you.
Exactly.
And those incentives are going to be given by those folks because obviously the airports don't collect those monies. And as mentioned, oftentimes there are a lot of taxes that are collected that never make their way back to the airport. But it's still, I think, you need to be working with your community economic development folks to attract people. And oftentimes what I see is they're building some facility within the community, not on the airport, but they have aircraft that are associated with their business and they need access to or a hangar at the airport. So you're seeing both they're bringing their business to the community and then using the airport as part of that.
Hector, anything else?
I think one of the other things that you can do is have those documents that I mentioned, because it not only does it make the process so much smoother, but to the potential client or the potential company or individual that wants to come to your community, when you have all those documents ready and you can show them specifically where they can build their hangar. And I would go one step further, and that is to have all of the different things that are required for permitting. I'm building a hangar right now, actually an FBO in Seattle. And I can tell you the list of things that you have to provide to King County is off the Richter scale. I mean, it's unbelievable, as we can all imagine. But every permitting authority is different. But if you've got a very concise list of all the various things that you need to do to comply, to get a permit, and you've got your airport documents, It shows a degree of professionalism that anybody that's coming to your community will appreciate.
All right, I've got to, Lisa's, she's not going to be happy with me. At 12:15, we're all supposed to go in for an interactive HR session that John Formica and Lisa Leith are going to spearhead. But before we leave, I would like to thank our panelists, and let's give them a round of applause, please. You can go to their websites, you can touch base with them, all that contact information. I think they've done a tremendous job, and certainly there's much more to talk about. Thank you again.